In the heart of London, where centuries of tradition meet modern-day chaos, a single moment can transform an ordinary person into an internet sensation overnight. What started as a typical tourist visit to one of Britain's most sacred military sites became a global phenomenon that would challenge everything people thought they knew about respect, authority, and the power of social media. The red-coated guards, standing motionless at Horse Guards Parade, had witnessed countless visitors over the decades. They had perfected the art of remaining stoic while tourists posed, laughed, and sometimes crossed invisible lines of protocol. But on this particular autumn morning, something different was about to unfold. Something that would capture the attention of millions worldwide and spark debates in living rooms, offices, and parliament halls across the globe. What happened next wasn't planned by anyone involved. The tourists didn't wake up thinking they'd become famous. The guard didn't expect to become the subject of international news coverage. The bystanders with their cameras ready didn't anticipate they were about to document a moment that would define conversations about tradition, respect, and viral culture for months to come. This is the story of how a single interaction between a visitor and a royal guard became more than just a moment of poor judgment. It became a mirror reflecting our modern society's relationship with authority, the power of instant fame, and the unexpected consequences of living in a world where everyone has a camera and every moment can become eternal. The incident would raise questions that nobody saw coming. Who is really at fault? What does respect mean in the digital age? And how does a moment of chaos reveal deeper truths about the world we live in today? This is that story. Sarah Mitchell had always been fascinated by British culture. Growing up in suburban Ohio, she had spent countless hours watching documentaries about the royal family, reading about British history, and dreaming of the day she would finally visit London. At 26, working as a marketing coordinator for a small tech company, she had saved every penny for 2 years to make this dream trip a reality. The October morning was crisp and clear when Sarah stepped out of her hotel near Trafalgar Square. She had planned her itinerary meticulously, wanting to see every major landmark during her 10-day visit. Horse Guards Parade was high on her list, not just for its historical significance, but because she had seen countless photos and videos of the iconic mounted sentries in their red tunics and black helmets. Sarah wasn't alone in her fascination. The area around Horse Guards was already buzzing with activity by 9 in the morning. Tourists from every corner of the world gathered with cameras, phones, and excited chatter in dozens of languages. The scene was familiar to anyone who had visited London's major attractions, a blend of awe, confusion, and the universal desire to capture the perfect photo. The Horse Guards themselves were a sight to behold. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active members of the British Army's household cavalry, trained soldiers who took their duty seriously. The tradition of mounting guard at Horse Guards dated back centuries, and despite the constant stream of tourists, the guards maintained their stoic composure with remarkable discipline. Lance Corporal James Harrison had been serving with the Blues and Royals for 4 years. At 24, he had already completed 2 tours of duty and understood the weight of the uniform he wore. Standing guard at Horse Guards wasn't just a ceremonial duty for him. It was a responsibility that connected him to generations of soldiers who had served before him. The red tunic, the polished boots, the ceremonial sword. Every element was steeped in history and tradition. James had grown accustomed to the constant attention from tourists. Most were respectful, content to take photos from a reasonable distance, and marvel at the pageantry. Some would try to get his attention, make jokes, or pose dramatically for photos, but he had learned to remain focused and professional. The key was to stay alert while appearing completely still, to be approachable enough to represent the best of British military tradition while maintaining the dignity the position required. Sarah approached the guard post with her phone ready, like so many tourists before her. She had studied the area online and knew that photos were allowed, but she also understood that there were unwritten rules about respectful behavior. At first, she followed the pattern of other visitors, taking photos from several feet away and admiring the impressive sight of the mounted guard. But as she watched other tourists getting closer for their photos, Sarah felt emboldened. She noticed that while the guards remained still, they didn't seem to react negatively to people approaching. Social media had taught her that the best content often came from pushing boundaries just a little bit, from getting that unique angle or moment that others wouldn't think to capture. The morning sun cast perfect shadows across the courtyard, and Sarah's marketing background kicked in. She thought about the kind of content that performed well online, the images that got shared and liked and commented on. A standard tourist photo wouldn't stand out in anyone's social media feed. She needed something different, something that would show her friends back home that she wasn't just another tourist following the crowd. Other visitors seemed to be having the same thought. A group of young men from Australia had been taking increasingly bold photos, getting closer to the horses and guards, laughing loudly and making jokes. An elderly couple from Germany was carefully posing for formal portraits, treating the scene with obvious reverence. A family with young children was trying to balance getting good photos while teaching their kids about respecting the guards and the tradition they represented. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and curiosity, but also with an underlying tension that nobody quite acknowledged. Everyone was pushing boundaries in small ways, testing how close they could get, how much interaction was possible, how far they could go before crossing an invisible line that nobody had clearly defined. Sarah noticed that the guard, Lance Corporal Harrison, had been particularly patient with visitors. She had watched him for nearly 20 minutes as people approached, took photos, and even tried to engage him in conversation. His horse, a magnificent bay gelding named Wellington, stood equally still and composed. The partnership between horse and rider was clearly the result of extensive training and mutual trust. As Sarah moved closer, she began to appreciate the incredible discipline required to maintain such composure. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his posture perfect, his expression neutral but alert. Even when children waved directly in front of him or tourists made loud comments about his appearance, he maintained his professional demeanor without the slightest reaction. The temptation to get a reaction, to be the one person who could break through that military composure, began to grow in Sarah's mind. It wasn't malicious. She genuinely admired what she was seeing and wanted to be part of it somehow. The marketing professional in her recognized the power of authentic moments, of capturing something real and unscripted that would resonate with audiences online. She began to move closer, her phone camera rolling, documenting her approach. In her mind, she was creating content that would show the human side of these ceremonial duties, that would give her followers a behind-the-scenes look at one of Britain's most famous traditions. She wasn't thinking about protocol or centuries of military tradition. She was thinking about connection, about creating a moment of genuine interaction. The other tourists began to notice her approach. Some stepped back, sensing that something was about to happen. Others moved closer with their own cameras, recognizing the potential for an interesting moment. The energy in the courtyard shifted subtly, as if everyone present could sense that the normal boundaries were about to be tested. Lance Corporal Harrison was aware of Sarah's approach long before she reached him. His training had taught him to be constantly alert to his surroundings while maintaining his ceremonial posture. He could see other tourists positioning themselves to film whatever was about to happen, and he felt the familiar tension that came with knowing he was about to be tested. Sarah reached out toward the guard's boot, thinking she might just touch it gently, maybe get a close-up shot that would show the incredible detail of the uniform. She wasn't thinking about the implications of touching an active duty soldier or the significance of interfering with official military duties. In her mind, she was just trying to create an engaging piece of content that would capture the majesty of the moment. What happened next would be viewed by millions of people around the world within hours. The moment Sarah's fingertips made contact with Lance Corporal Harrison's polished black boot, everything changed. What had been a peaceful morning of tourist photography suddenly erupted into something entirely different. The guard's response was immediate, professional, and exactly what his training had prepared him for, but it would shock everyone present and soon shock the world. Step back immediately. Harrison's voice cut through the morning air with startling authority. The command wasn't shouted, but it carried the weight of military discipline and absolute clarity. Sarah jerked her hand away, startled by the sudden break in the guard's stoic silence. She stepped backward instinctively, her phone still recording, capturing her own surprised expression as she tried to process what had just happened. But Harrison wasn't finished. His horse, Wellington, shifted slightly under him, sensing the tension and responding to his rider's alertness. "You are interfering with official duties," Harrison continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced clarity. "Photography is permitted, but physical contact with guards or horses is strictly prohibited." The crowd of tourists that had been casually milling about suddenly found themselves witnesses to an official confrontation. Phones came out from every direction as people realized they were watching something significant unfold. The Australian group stopped their joking and began filming seriously. The elderly German couple looked concerned and stepped further back. Parents pulled their children closer, unsure whether this was part of the show or a real situation developing. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, still holding her phone, still recording. Her face showed a mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and defiance. "I barely touched anything," she said, her American accent suddenly very obvious in a distinctly British setting. "I was just trying to get a good photo. Isn't that what people do here?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the fundamental misunderstanding that had led to this moment. Sarah genuinely believed she was participating in what she thought was an interactive tourist experience. She had seen countless social media posts of people posing with guards, getting close to the horses, creating content that suggested a more casual relationship between visitors and the ceremonial duties taking place. Harrison remained mounted, his posture unchanged, his professional composure intact despite the situation escalating around him. "This is not a tourist attraction," he explained, his voice steady but firm. "We are active duty soldiers performing official duties for Her Majesty's Guard. Physical interference constitutes a breach of military protocol and public order." By now, a crowd had gathered in a circle around the confrontation. What started as perhaps 20 casual tourists had grown to more than 50 people, all with cameras pointed at Sarah and Harrison. The clicking of phone cameras and the quiet murmur of commentary in multiple languages created an atmosphere of intense scrutiny that neither Sarah nor Harrison had anticipated when the morning began. Sarah's initial embarrassment was beginning to transform into something else. She could feel the weight of all those cameras, all those eyes, all that judgment. The marketing professional in her began to recognize that she was now part of a story, and she had a choice about how that story would be told. She could apologize and retreat quietly, or she could stand her ground and make her case. "I'm sorry, but I think you're overreacting," Sarah said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "I barely brushed against your boot. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone or cause any problems. This is supposed to be about sharing British culture with visitors, right? How are people supposed to appreciate what you do if they can't get close enough to see it properly?" The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Some tourists nodded in apparent agreement, feeling that Sarah was expressing what many of them had been thinking. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing that she was making the situation worse by arguing rather than apologizing. The cameras continued recording, capturing every word, every expression, every moment of an encounter that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Harrison faced a dilemma that his training had prepared him for, but that he had hoped never to encounter. He could dismount and formally place Sarah under arrest for interfering with military duties, which was within his authority, but would create an enormous spectacle. He could request backup from the Metropolitan Police, who patrolled the area regularly, but that would escalate the situation further. Or he could try to de-escalate through continued verbal warnings, hoping that Sarah would recognize the seriousness of the situation and leave voluntarily. "Miss, I need you to understand that what you see as a tourist experience is actually a military operation," Harrison said, choosing his words carefully. "These horses are working animals, and we are working soldiers. Physical contact without permission can startle the horses, disrupt our duties, and create safety hazards for everyone present. I need you to step back and allow us to continue our duties without interference." But Sarah was no longer focused solely on Harrison. She had become acutely aware of the crowd, of the cameras, of the fact that her every word and action was being recorded by dozens of people. The situation had transformed from a simple tourist moment into what felt like a public trial, with her character and behavior being judged by strangers from around the world. "I understand what you're saying," Sarah replied, "but I think there's a bigger issue here about how tourists are treated and what expectations are set. I've seen hundreds of photos and videos of people interacting with guards. Nobody ever told me there were specific rules about touching. Maybe the problem isn't that I made a mistake, but that visitors aren't properly informed about what's allowed and what isn't." The crowd murmured with renewed interest. Sarah had shifted the conversation from her specific action to a broader critique of how the tourist experience was managed. Some visitors nodded appreciatively, feeling that she was raising valid points about communication and expectations. Others looked increasingly uncomfortable, feeling that she was refusing to take responsibility for her actions and making excuses instead of apologizing. A middle-aged British woman in the crowd stepped forward slightly. "Excuse me, love, but there are signs posted about not touching the guards or horses," she said with the kind of polite firmness that only the British seemed to master. "And it's rather common sense, isn't it? You wouldn't walk up and touch a police officer or soldier on duty anywhere else, would you?" Sarah turned to face her new critic, and the crowd shifted to accommodate this new dynamic. "With respect, I didn't see any signs that made that clear," Sarah responded. "And actually, in many places, police and military personnel are much more interactive with the public. I think the issue is that this whole setup creates confusion about what kind of experience this is supposed to be." Harrison watched this exchange with growing concern. What had started as a simple protocol enforcement was becoming a public debate about tourist rights, military duties, and cultural expectations. More concerning, he could see additional tourists gathering as word spread that something interesting was happening at Horse Guards. The crowd was growing larger and more vocal, and the situation was moving further away from any easy resolution. Wellington, his horse, was also becoming increasingly agitated by the prolonged confrontation and the growing crowd. The animal's training was excellent, but horses are sensitive to tension and unusual situations. Harrison could feel Wellington shifting beneath him, responding to the charged atmosphere and the press of people around them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison announced, addressing the entire crowd rather than just Sarah, "I need everyone to step back and allow normal operations to continue. This area needs to remain clear for security and safety reasons." But his words had the opposite effect. Instead of dispersing, more people pushed forward, eager to hear what was happening and to capture their own footage of the confrontation. The situation was rapidly becoming exactly what Harrison's training had taught him to avoid: a crowd control issue in a high-security area with an uncooperative individual at the center. Sarah seemed to recognize that the moment had grown beyond her original intentions, but she was now committed to a path that she felt she couldn't abandon without losing face in front of all these cameras. The marketing professional in her understood that backing down now would make her look weak and wrong in whatever viral video this was about to become. "I think we need to agree to disagree about this," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I'm going to continue my tour of London, and I hope people can see that this was just a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion." It was at that moment that two Metropolitan Police officers appeared at the edge of the crowd, having been alerted by other tourists that a disturbance was developing at Horse Guards. Their arrival would transform what had been a confrontation between a tourist and a guard into something much more serious and far-reaching. Police constables David Thompson and Lisa Patel had been patrolling the Westminster area for 3 years and had seen their share of tourist incidents at London's major landmarks. When they received a radio call about a disturbance at Horse Guards, they expected to find the usual scenario: an overeager visitor who needed a gentle reminder about appropriate behavior and perhaps directions to the nearest information center. What they found instead was a crowd of more than 70 people forming a tight circle around a mounted guard and an obviously agitated American woman, with dozens of phone cameras capturing every moment. The energy was electric and volatile, with voices rising in multiple languages as tourists debated what they were witnessing and chose sides in a conflict they didn't fully understand. Right then, "What's all this about?" Constable Thompson asked as he and Patel approached the center of the disturbance. His voice carried the authority of experience, but also a measured calm designed to de-escalate rather than inflame the situation. Lance Corporal Harrison felt a wave of relief at the police officer's arrival. "Officers, this individual made physical contact with my uniform despite verbal warnings about protocol," he reported with military precision. "She has refused to acknowledge the seriousness of interfering with official duties and has been arguing with instructions to maintain appropriate distance." Sarah immediately turned to face the police officers, her phone still in her hand, still recording. "Officers, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who genuinely believed she was in the right. "I barely touched this gentleman's boot while trying to take a photograph. I think his response has been completely disproportionate to what actually happened." Constable Patel stepped forward, her experienced eye quickly assessing the situation. She could see the tension in Harrison's posture, the agitation in his horse, and the increasingly charged atmosphere of the crowd. More concerning, she could see that traffic had begun to slow on the nearby roads as people stopped to see what was happening, creating a potential public safety issue beyond the immediate confrontation. "Miss, I'm going to need you to step over here with me so we can sort this out," Patel said, gesturing away from the crowd. Her tone was professional but firm, making it clear that this was not a request, but a direction that needed to be followed. But Sarah hesitated, looking around at the crowd, at all the cameras still pointed at her. The moment felt pivotal, and she sensed that how she responded would determine how this story would be told online and in the media. "I don't think I should be the one who has to move," she said. "I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal for what was obviously just a misunderstanding." The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Some tourists began voicing support for Sarah, feeling that she was being treated unfairly by authorities who were overreacting to a minor incident. Others called out for her to just cooperate and apologize so everyone could move on. The Australian group that had been there from the beginning started chanting, "Leave her alone," while the elderly German couple looked increasingly distressed by the escalating confrontation. Thompson recognized the signs of a situation spiraling toward a more serious confrontation. His radio crackled with updates from other units who were beginning to respond to reports of a growing crowd and possible public disturbance in a high-security area. He knew that every moment the situation continued would draw more attention, more people, and increase the likelihood of a much bigger problem. "Miss, I understand you feel this is unfair, but I need you to cooperate with our instructions," Thompson said, moving slightly closer. "We're not here to arrest anyone or cause problems. We just need to clear this area and sort out what happened in a calmer environment." Sarah's response surprised everyone present, including herself. "No, I don't think I will move," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I think what's happening here is wrong, and I think people should see it. I came to London to experience British culture, and what I'm experiencing is that tourists are treated with suspicion and hostility for normal behavior that happens at tourist sites all over the world." The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and groans. Sarah had transformed her personal confrontation into a broader statement about tourist rights and treatment, and many in the crowd felt she was speaking for them and their own experiences with confusing or unclear expectations at tourist sites. Others felt she was being unnecessarily confrontational and turning a simple misunderstanding into a major incident. Patel exchanged a look with Thompson, and both officers recognized that they had moved beyond the realm of simple crowd control. Sarah's refusal to cooperate with police instructions, combined with her increasingly defiant stance, had created a situation that required formal intervention under British law. "Miss, you are now obstructing police officers in the execution of their duties," Patel announced clearly, making sure her words carried to the entire crowd. "I'm going to give you one final opportunity to step aside voluntarily and cooperate with our investigation of this incident." The words sent a ripple of excitement and apprehension through the crowd. People understood that they were witnessing something serious now, something that would have real consequences beyond social media posts and travel stories. Phones were raised higher, cameras zoomed in closer, and the murmur of commentary grew louder as people provided running narratives for their recordings. Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything rational in her mind told her to apologize, cooperate, and try to salvage what remained of her London vacation. But something else, something driven by pride, by the presence of all those cameras, by a sense that she was now representing something larger than herself, kept her feet planted where they stood. "I'm not obstructing anything," she said, her voice now loud enough to carry clearly across the entire courtyard. "I'm standing here exercising my rights as a visitor to your country. If that's obstruction, then maybe the problem isn't with tourists, it's with how you treat people who come here to appreciate what Britain has to offer." The crowd's response was the loudest yet, with clear divisions emerging between those who supported Sarah's stance and those who thought she had gone too far. A group of young backpackers began applauding, while several families with children started moving away from the confrontation, uncomfortable with the increasingly hostile atmosphere. Thompson stepped forward and made the decision that would transform this incident from a local disturbance into international news. "Sarah Mitchell, I am placing you under arrest for obstructing police officers in the execution of their duties and for disturbing the peace," he announced formally. "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." The crowd exploded in reaction. Cheers, boos, shouted commentary, and the rapid-fire clicking of dozens of cameras created a cacophony that echoed off the historic buildings surrounding Horse Guards Parade. Sarah's face showed shock, defiance, and fear in rapid succession as the reality of her situation hit her fully for the first time. "This is ridiculous," she shouted as Thompson approached with handcuffs. "I'm being arrested for touching someone's boot. This is exactly the kind of treatment that gives British tourism a bad reputation." But even as she protested, Sarah extended her hands to be cuffed, her marketing background finally kicking in with the recognition that physically resisting arrest would make everything exponentially worse. The handcuffs clicked into place as Thompson and Patel began the formal process of taking her into custody. Lance Corporal Harrison watched the arrest with mixed feelings. His training had been vindicated, protocol had been maintained, and his duty had been properly supported by the civil authorities. But he also recognized that what had started as a simple correction of inappropriate behavior had escalated into something that would likely have consequences far beyond what anyone had intended. As the police officers began to escort Sarah away from Horse Guards, the crowd began to disperse, but slowly and reluctantly. Many tourists remained, discussing what they had witnessed, debating who was right and wrong, and already beginning to upload their recordings to social media platforms around the world. Wellington, Harrison's horse, finally began to relax as the immediate tension subsided. But the morning's events had created ripple effects that were already beginning to spread far beyond the historic courtyard where they had unfolded. Sarah Mitchell's arrest at Horse Guards would become a global phenomenon within hours, but None of the participants yet understood the magnitude of what they had set in motion. The first video appeared on TikTok 18 minutes after Sarah Mitchell's arrest. Marcus Chun, a 22-year-old exchange student from Singapore, had been filming the entire confrontation from start to finish. His hands shaking with excitement, he uploaded a 3-minute compilation with the caption, "American tourist arrested at Buckingham Palace for touching royal guard." Despite the geographical error in his caption, the video began attracting views immediately. Within 2 hours, Marcus's video had been viewed 50,000 times. Within 6 hours, it had reached 500,000 views and had been shared across every major social media platform. The story was spreading with a viral velocity that only the most compelling content could achieve in the digital age, and it was gathering momentum that surprised everyone involved in its creation. Sarah, meanwhile, was experiencing the British justice system firsthand. At Charing Cross Police Station, she sat in an interview room across from Constable Thompson and a duty solicitor who had been assigned to her case. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in as she faced the possibility of formal charges, a criminal record, and an international incident that could affect her ability to travel and work. "Miss Mitchell, I want you to understand that this situation can still be resolved relatively simply," the solicitor, James Whitman, explained in his measured professional tone. "If you're willing to accept a police caution for the public order offense, you can likely avoid formal charges and be released this afternoon." Sarah stared at the paperwork in front of her, but her mind was racing with thoughts about what was happening outside the police station. She had seen the phones, the cameras, the excited faces of people who knew they were witnessing something that would be shared online. "What exactly would a police caution mean for my record?" she asked. "It would remain on your record for 6 years, and you would need to declare it on certain applications, particularly for visas or employment in sensitive sectors," Whitman explained. "However, it's significantly less serious than formal charges and trial." But even as Sarah considered her options, the story was taking on a life of its own online. Marcus's original TikTok had been picked up by larger accounts, reposted, commented on, and dissected by millions of users around the world. The comment section had become a battleground of opinions about tourist behavior, British culture, police authority, and American privilege. "This is what happens when Americans think they can do whatever they want in other countries," wrote at London Living 247. "The guard was totally overreacting. She barely touched his boot," responded a travel blogger Sarah. "As a Brit, I'm embarrassed by how our police treated this tourist," added a Covent Garden local. The video was being shared with wildly different narratives depending on who was sharing it. American social media users largely framed it as an example of British authoritarianism and poor treatment of tourists. British users were more likely to present it as an example of American entitlement and disrespect for local customs and authority. International users seemed split, with many expressing confusion about what the actual rules were and whether Sarah's behavior warranted arrest. News organizations began picking up the story by early evening. The BBC's social media team noticed the trending hashtags and assigned a junior reporter to investigate. Sky News sent a camera crew to Horse Guards to get reaction footage and interviews with tourists. American news networks began reaching out to Sarah's family in Ohio, trying to get quotes and background information about the woman who was becoming an international talking point. Sarah's sister, Jennifer, received the first call from a reporter while she was at work at a dental office in Columbus. "I'm sorry, you're calling about what?" Jennifer asked, certain she had misunderstood. "Sarah was arrested in London? That can't be right. She's just there on vacation." But as Jennifer began searching online during her lunch break, she found dozens of videos, hundreds of news articles, and thousands of social media posts about her sister's arrest. The reality hit her that Sarah had become the center of a global controversy, and the family was about to be thrust into international attention whether they wanted it or not. Back in London, Lance Corporal Harrison was discovering that his moment of viral fame was more complicated than he had anticipated. His commanding officers had been contacted by the Ministry of Defense press office, who wanted to understand exactly what had happened and whether the guard's response had been appropriate. Harrison found himself writing detailed reports about the incident, while his social media-savvy younger sister sent him screenshots of the various posts featuring his image. "James, you're like properly famous now," his sister texted him. "But half the comments are calling you a power-mad bully, and the other half are calling you a hero for standing up for British values." It's mental. The story was evolving hourly as new angles emerged. Travel bloggers began posting about their own experiences with unclear rules at tourist attractions. Military veterans weighed in on the appropriateness of the guard's response. Legal experts discussed the proportionality of Sarah's arrest. Cultural commentators used the incident to explore broader themes about respect, authority, and cross-cultural misunderstandings. Dr. Angela Martinez, a professor of tourism studies at the University of Westminster, found herself fielding calls from journalists around the world. What we're seeing here is a perfect storm of cultural miscommunication, unclear expectations, and the amplifying effect of social media, she explained to a BBC interviewer. This incident raises important questions about how we communicate behavioral expectations to international visitors at heritage sites. The economic implications were beginning to concern tourism officials as well. London's tourism board started receiving calls from American travel agents asking about safety for their clients and whether anti-American sentiment was growing in Britain. Hotel concierges reported fielding unusual numbers of questions from American guests about what was and wasn't allowed at various attractions. Sarah's employer in Ohio was also dealing with unexpected attention. The small tech company where she worked as a marketing coordinator suddenly found their phones ringing with media inquiries about their employee who had become an international incident. Her manager, David Rodriguez, struggled to balance supporting Sarah with protecting the company's reputation. "Sarah is a valued employee and a good person who made an error in judgment," Rodriguez told the Columbus Dispatch. "We hope this situation can be resolved quickly and fairly, and that everyone can learn something from it about cultural sensitivity and appropriate behavior when traveling." But the story continued to grow beyond anyone's control. Memes began appearing with Sarah's image, turning her into a symbol for various cultural and political points. Late-night talk show hosts in America began including the incident in their opening monologues. British comedy panel shows started making jokes about American tourists and cultural insensitivity. The hashtags #tourist rights, #respect the guards, #London arrest, and #horse guards incident were trending globally by the end of the day. Sarah had become not just a news story, but a cultural touchstone for broader conversations about privilege, respect, authority, and the power of viral media to transform ordinary people into international symbols. In her cell at Charing Cross Police Station, Sarah was largely unaware of the magnitude of attention her arrest had generated. She had been allowed one phone call to her sister, who had tried to explain the situation, but Sarah couldn't quite grasp that millions of people around the world were now discussing her actions and their consequences. "Jenny, I just touched his boot for like 2 seconds, Sarah had said during the call. "How did this turn as such a big deal?" The answer to her question was unfolding across social media platforms, news websites, and dinner table conversations around the globe. Her simple act of curiosity had become a mirror reflecting deep cultural divisions, different understandings of authority and respect, and the unpredictable power of digital media to transform personal moments into global phenomena. The incident had taken on meanings and significance far beyond what anyone involved had intended or anticipated. Sarah Mitchell, who had simply wanted to capture an interesting moment during her dream vacation, had inadvertently become the center of international debates about tourism, culture, privilege, and the complex dynamics of modern global communication. As evening fell over London, the story showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, it was gathering momentum that would carry it through news cycles, academic discussions, policy debates, and cultural commentary for months to come. The viral explosion was just the beginning of a much larger story about how a single moment of poor judgment could resonate across continents and cultures in ways that nobody could have predicted. 3 months after the incident at Horse Guards, Sarah Mitchell sat in a coffee shop in downtown Columbus, staring at her laptop screen and trying to understand how her life had changed so dramatically. The Google search for her name returned over 2 million results, ranging from serious news articles to satirical memes, academic papers, and conspiracy theories about American tourists being deliberately targeted by British authorities. She had returned to Ohio 2 days after her arrest, having accepted the police caution against her solicitor's initial advice. The decision haunted her daily, not because of the legal implications, but because of what it had come to represent to millions of people who had never met her, but felt entitled to judge her character, her intelligence, and her worthiness as a human being. The marketing coordinator position she had held for 3 years was gone. Her employer had initially been supportive, but as the story continued to generate negative publicity and potential customers began associating the company with that American tourist who got arrested, the situation became untenable. David Rodriguez had called her into his office 6 weeks after her return with obvious discomfort. "Sarah, you know we value you as an employee and as a person," he had said, unable to make eye contact. "But we're a small company, and we can't afford to have this kind of attention affecting our client relationships. I'm sorry, but we have to let you go." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her background in marketing had taught her to understand exactly how viral content worked and how brands needed to protect their reputations. She knew her employer's decision was logical from a business perspective, even as it felt devastating from a personal one. Finding new employment had proven nearly impossible. Every interviewer seemed to recognize her name, and those who didn't would inevitably discover her internet fame during routine background checks. Some potential employers were openly hostile, viewing her as a troublemaker who might bring negative attention to their organizations. Others were merely uncomfortable, unsure how to separate the person sitting in front of them from the viral symbol she had become online. The financial implications were mounting. Sarah had burned through her savings during 2 months of unemployment, and her parents had been helping with rent and basic expenses. The legal fees from her London solicitor had been minimal, but the cost of trying to repair her online reputation had been substantial. She had hired a digital marketing firm that specialized in reputation management, but their efforts had yielded limited results. "The challenge is that your story has become larger than just you," explained Rebecca Chen from the reputation management firm during their monthly check-in call. "People aren't really arguing about Sarah Mitchell anymore. They're arguing about American privilege, British authority, tourist behavior, and cultural sensitivity. You've become a symbol, and symbols are much harder to manage than individual reputations." The symbolism had taken on meanings that shifted depending on who was using her story. Conservative commentators in America had embraced her as an example of British overreach and anti-American sentiment. Progressive voices had criticized her as emblematic of American entitlement abroad. British nationalist groups had used her arrest as evidence that their country was too soft on foreign visitors who disrespected local customs. Tourism advocates had pointed to her case as evidence of the need for clearer communication about behavioral expectations at heritage sites. Sarah had received thousands of messages through various social media platforms and email accounts. Many were supportive, particularly from fellow travelers who felt that her punishment had been disproportionate to her action. Others were viciously critical, some containing personal threats that had prompted her to involve local police in Columbus. The most disturbing messages came from people who seemed to view her as representing everything they disliked about Americans, tourists, women, or millennials. The psychological toll had been severe. Sarah had begun seeing a therapist to help process the experience of unwanted global fame and the constant judgment from strangers. Dr. Patricia Williams specialized in helping people who had experienced sudden notoriety, and she helped Sarah understand that her feelings of violation and loss of control were normal responses to having one's private moment transformed into public property. What you're experiencing is a form of trauma that's become increasingly common in our digital age, Dr. Williams explained. When someone's personal experience becomes viral content, they lose control over their own narrative. Millions of people feel entitled to judge you based on a 3-minute video, without any context about who you are as a person or what your intentions were. Lance Corporal James Harrison had also struggled with the aftermath of his viral fame, though his experience had been markedly different from Sarah's. The military had conducted a thorough investigation of his actions and concluded that his response had been entirely appropriate and professional. His commanding officers had commended him for maintaining protocol under difficult circumstances and handling a challenging situation with composure. However, the personal impact had been more complex. Harrison found himself recognized on the street, in pubs, and even during off-duty activities. Some people approached him as a hero who had stood up for British values and military tradition. Others viewed him as an overzealous authority figure who had overreacted to harmless tourist behavior. The attention had made him more self-conscious about his role and more aware of how his actions might be perceived and recorded by the constant presence of tourist cameras. His girlfriend, Emma, had struggled with the relationship being thrust into public attention. "I didn't sign up to date someone famous," she told him during one of their increasingly frequent arguments about the unwanted attention. "I can't even go to horse guards to see you without people recognizing us and want to take photos or ask questions about what happened." The tourism industry had responded to the incident with mixed reactions and concrete changes. Visit Britain, the national tourism agency, had launched a campaign called Respectful Tourism that included clear guidelines about appropriate behavior at heritage sites and military installations. The campaign featured prominently placed signage at major attractions, social media content educating potential visitors, and partnerships with travel bloggers to spread awareness about cultural sensitivity. Horse Guards Parade itself had implemented new measures following the incident. Additional signage in multiple languages now clearly outlined prohibited behaviors, including physical contact with guards, horses, and equipment. Tourist information officers were stationed nearby during peak hours to answer questions and provide guidance about appropriate photography and behavior. The changes have been effective in reducing incidents, but they had also changed the atmosphere of the site, making it feel more controlled and less spontaneous. The academic community had embraced Sarah's case as a rich source of research material. Dr. Angela Martinez at the University of Westminster had published a widely cited paper titled Viral Tourism: How Social Media Transforms Cultural Incidents into Global Phenomena. The paper examined how digital platforms amplified cross-cultural misunderstandings and turned individual tourists into international symbols. The Mitchell incident demonstrates how social media creates a feedback loop that can transform minor cultural misunderstandings into major diplomatic and social issues, Dr. Martinez wrote. The speed and scale of digital communication mean that local incidents can become global controversies before anyone involved has time to understand or manage the situation effectively. Other researchers had used the case to examine questions of justice, proportionality, and cultural sensitivity in tourism. Legal scholars debated whether arrest had been an appropriate response to Sarah's behavior. Anthropologists analyzed the incident as an example of cultural collision in globalized spaces. Communications experts studied how different groups had used the same video footage to support completely different narratives about what had happened and what it meant. The incident had also influenced policy discussions in both countries. British tourism officials had worked with law enforcement to develop clearer guidelines about when arrest was appropriate for tourist behavior violations. The goal was to maintain respect for cultural sites and military traditions while avoiding the creation of international incidents over minor infractions. American Consular Services had used Sarah's case as an example in their travel guidance materials, emphasizing the importance of understanding and respecting local customs when traveling abroad. The State Department had quietly engaged with British counterparts to ensure that future incidents would be handled with appropriate consideration for their potential international implications. Sarah's family had also been affected by her unwanted fame. Her parents had received media attention that they neither wanted nor understood. Her sister Jennifer had been approached by reporters, received friend requests from strangers, and found herself defending or explaining Sarah's actions to people who felt entitled to express their opinions about the incident. The hardest part is that everyone thinks they know Sarah based on that video. Jennifer explained to a local reporter who was writing a follow-up story 6 months after the incident. But they're judging my sister based on 3 minutes of video from what was obviously a stressful and confusing situation. The Sarah I know is thoughtful, respectful, and would never intentionally cause problems for anyone. As Sarah sat in the Columbus coffee shop, reflecting on the months since her arrest, she struggled to reconcile the person she knew herself to be with the public figure she had inadvertently become. The viral video had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, and her image had been shared, mocked, defended, and analyzed by people in dozens of countries who would never meet her or understand the full context of what had happened. She had begun writing about her experience, partly as therapy and partly as an attempt to reclaim some control over her narrative. The blog post she had started publishing on a simple website called Beyond the Viral Moment attracted modest but growing readership from people who had experienced similar unwanted internet fame or who were interested in the psychological and social implications of viral culture. I want people to understand that behind every viral video is a real person who didn't ask to become a global symbol, she wrote in one post. I made a mistake in judgment, and I've taken responsibility for that. But the punishment I've experienced through public shaming, job loss, and constant judgment from strangers has been far more severe than anything any court would have imposed. The response to her writing had been mixed, but generally more thoughtful than the initial viral reaction. Some readers accused her of seeking attention or failing to take full responsibility for her actions. Others expressed sympathy and shared their own experiences of being publicly shamed online. A few mental health advocates had reached out to discuss the psychological impact of viral fame and the need for more compassion in how society treats people who become internet sensations against their will. Sarah had also begun speaking at conferences and universities about digital citizenship, viral culture, and the human cost of internet fame. The speaking engagements provided some income and gave her a sense of purpose, though she remained ambivalent about building a career around the worst moment of her life. Lance Corporal Harrison had been promoted and transferred to a different unit, partly to help him escape the constant attention that came with remaining a Horse Guards. He had declined numerous media requests and commercial opportunities related to his viral fame, preferring to let his military service speak for itself rather than capitalizing on the incident. The long-term implications of the incident continued to unfold in ways that nobody could have predicted. Sarah's arrest had become a case study in business schools about reputation management and crisis communication. It was discussed in sociology classes as an example of how social media amplifies cultural conflicts. Law schools use it to examine questions of proportionality in law enforcement and the international implications of local policing decisions. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had contributed to ongoing discussions about how societies should balance respect for tradition and authority with accommodation for cultural differences and honest mistakes. Sarah Mitchell's momentary lapse in judgment had revealed deeper tensions about identity, respect, privilege, and justice that extended far beyond one tourist interaction with one guard on one autumn morning in London. As she closed her laptop and prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sarah reflected on the strange reality that her life had become. She remained unemployed, financially struggling, and psychologically scarred by her experience of unwanted global fame. But she had also gained unexpected insights into human nature, media dynamics, and the complex ways that individual actions could resonate across cultures and continents. The viral moment that had changed everything was still unfolding, still generating discussion, still serving as a mirror for different societies to examine their own values and assumptions. Sarah Mitchell had become more than just a tourist who made a mistake. She had become a symbol of the unpredictable and often harsh realities of life in the digital age, where any moment could become eternal and any person could become famous for all the wrong reasons.